Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Tasmania Island of Ideas public talk series, and especially to tonight's Australian Red Cross oration. Those of us who are gathered here together physically meet on Muwinina country. The Muwinina people are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on this western side of the Derwent River, from Bridgewater in the north to Kettering in the south. And in acknowledging them as traditional owners and custodians of this land, I also acknowledge that their sovereignty over this land was never ceded. Normally, in making an acknowledgement of traditional owners, we would also pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. In the case of the Muwinina and so many other of the bands of this heart-shaped island we love to call home, the impact of colonial invasion and dispossession was so overwhelming that we know of no descendants of the Muwinina people. And that is an experience repeated in many parts of this state. That's a tragic loss of culture, of language, of history. So I pay my respects to the elders past of the Muwinina and to those who never reached elder status. But let me not create the impression that from my perspective, the Muwinina are irrelevant now to this beautiful city we love to call our home, because the spirits of their people imbue every aspect of it that we delight in. We as a university acknowledge the Palawa people as the traditional owners of the island state. And fortunately for us, despite the decimation of so many of the bands of our First Peoples, a group of them survived, predominantly on the islands in Bass Strait in the northeast, the Furneaux group. And to them and their descendants, we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As we come together to listen to tonight's subject matter, the future battlefield, is there a place for humanity? I would like to acknowledge that this emerging law of armed conflict that our speaker tonight will focus on in relation to the future was developed in the second half of the 19th century, and it was never applied to the colonial frontier wars in this part of Australia or anywhere else in Australia or anywhere else in the colonial world as Indigenous people were decimated as a consequence of colonial dispossession. That, I think, is a really important observation to make as we deal with this subject matter. I'm Professor Tim McCormack, Professor of International Law here at the Law School at the University of Tasmania. It's my responsibility and pleasure to now introduce to you Professor Gino Dalpont, our Interim Dean of Law, and my magnificent boss. He will provide an official welcome on behalf of the University. Thanks very much, Gino.
Thank you very much, Tim. You are prone to exaggeration when it came to that magnificent comment. But nonetheless, on behalf of the University of Tasmania, it's my great pleasure likewise to express a heartfelt welcome to each of you who've come here physically this evening. And according to the notes that I was given here, I should say something like all of you who've bravely battled the Tasmanian winter to come here. But those that know Tasmania will know that what's outside is actually very mild and very pleasant, and there's nothing too brave, and in fact something very good about being here this evening. And of course we welcome those who are joining us online from the comfort of their own homes. Now, with the inaugural lecture delivered some 16 years ago, it's an honour to participate in what is now proven to be a long-standing tradition. The annual Red Cross oration is a collaboration between the University of Tasmania and the Australian Red Cross, and the purpose of the oration is to advance our community's understandings of issues that connect broadly with the University, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. Speakers invariably are internationally renowned, And while they may emerge from a variety of disciplines, each oration focuses on an important contemporary issue that has a distinctly human meaning and importance. And tonight's will be no exception. The topic this evening is of considerable importance to the university. Never has it been more significant to discuss how we preserve those who are unable to protect themselves amidst the horrors of warfare. We witness civil unrest, wars, geopolitical tensions, armed conflicts that continue to create humanitarian crises and mass displacements in countries spanning the globe. And as we stand on the threshold of what tonight is described as a future battlefield, where technology, environmental challenges, the pursuit of inclusivity shape our actions, we must contemplate how the frameworks of international humanitarian law and their ability to safeguard the most vulnerable. The university here is uniquely positioned in arguably, and most of us would agree, mercifully the safest and most untouched corner of the world, is deeply committed to the protection of the environment as a vulnerable and cherished entity under threat. And by exploring the ethical dimensions of international humanitarian law and its potential to safeguard not only human life but the delicate ecosystems of our planet, we exemplify our university's dedication to the promotion of a sustainable, empathetic and responsible approach to addressing the challenges of the modern world. And as we discuss the implications of armed conflicts on both human and environmental vulnerabilities, with that we reinforce our collective responsibility to preserve and protect the precious natural resources that define our unique and diverse landscapes here in this island. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you and our honoured guest, Dr Helen Durham AO, to discuss the future battlefield. Is there a place for humanity? Being the 2023 Red Cross oration. Thank you.
Thank you, Gino. There is no one better in all the world to deliver tonight's oration, The Future Battlefield. Is there a place for humanity? And it's my honour to briefly explain to you why that's the case. Helen Durham studied arts and law at the University of Melbourne and then went on to undertake a PhD, which I had the enormous privilege of supervising. After she'd completed her PhD, she worked for Australian Red Cross as manager of the International Humanitarian Program. And we worked really closely together while I was chair of the National Advisory Committee on International Humanitarian Law of Red Cross. It took 3 years to move to Sydney to take up an appointment as a legal advisor to the Pacific delegation of the Red Cross, headquartered in Suva, but with a legal advisor in Australia, and came back to Melbourne and spent some time at the Asia Pacific Centre for Military Law as our Director of Research. I was the Director of the Centre at the time. And then Helen had a stratospheric breakthrough in her career when she was appointed in 2014 to be the Director of International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. I'm a bit emotional about that because that was a spectacular appointment. Those of you who don't understand the International Committee of the Red Cross might need to know that it was established in 1863, and in more than 150 years of operation, there had never been a woman in the role of the Director of International Law and Policy. There had never been a non-Swiss national. Think about that. 150 years, and every single Director of International Law and Policy was a Swiss national. Please don't misunderstand me, I've got nothing against the Swiss. There had never been an Australian, And there'd never been a person who had come to the International Committee of the Cross into the directorate who had been a former employee of a national Red Cross or Red Crescent Society. This is 4 glass ceilings smashed in one go. The directorate of the International Committee of the Red Cross is a group of 6 directors, all who report directly to the Director General, the CEO. Those 7 people are responsible for the administration of a budget of $3 billion a year. That's a big number, and it's a very significant role. Imagine when you think about those 4 novelties in this person being appointed to the position, the scepticism amongst so many people. What's just happened? Someone from the arse end of the world, I'm sure they don't say it that way, either in German or in French or in Schweizerdeutsch or Italian, or even in English actually, from the other side of the world is coming to take this very senior role. Well, she didn't just smash the glass ceilings, she smashed through that scepticism and did it, in my view, as a consequence of a unique combination of strengths. One of them is her intellectual acuity. She is a very bright and hardworking person. The second one is the subject matter expertise. She did a PhD in this body of law that is so important to the International Committee, the Red Cross. She had razor-sharp clarity about exactly what her role was, what she was required to do, and what she wasn't responsible for. She had fierce determination to faithfully represent her staff, and when a decision was taken in the legal division, she fought for it when she needed to, and her staff grew to love her and admire her as a consequence. She has incredible communication skills, and you're about to see some of them on display tonight, and profoundly mature emotional intelligence, rare in my experience in senior management positions. But Helen is as comfortable briefing the United Nations Security Council in New York, engaging with Thai royalty, talking to Russian military, or sitting in a circle on a dirt floor in the global south with a group of local women. She can talk to an audience that's thousands and hold their attention, or she can talk to you eye to eye and you know she's listening. She has a deep and genuine heart for the victims of armed conflict, and this for me is the single most significant thing about her, because I mean, if the rest didn't happen, the rest of the package, okay, but this makes her genuine and authentic. Not surprising to me that she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2017, or upon her return to Australia, to Melbourne last year after 8 years in this role as Director of International Law and Policy. She's been snapped up as a Professorial Fellow at Melbourne Law School, as a Senior Fellow of the Lieber Institute at West Point Military Academy in upstate New York in the US, and starting Monday as the brand new CEO of the Red R organisation in Australia with some other regional offices. I want to borrow a quote, or sort of part of a quote, a concept from the Apostle Paul to make an observation about Dr Helen Durham. These 3 things remain, in his case, talking about faith, hope and love, and the greatest of all is love. These 3 things remain: international humanitarian law. If we do it in French, we get it in the right order. Droit international humanitaire. She is a truly global citizen, travelled all over the world, engaged with governments, with people everywhere. She is an incredible lawyer, but the greatest of these 3 is the humanitarian being. And Helen is a deeply humane person. We're the lucky ones tonight. Please join with me in welcoming Dr Helen Durham.
Good evening, and thank you, Tim, for that really emotional and heartfelt introduction. I really appreciate that. Now you'll get me all weepy, so we've got to be careful. So thank you very much. I am absolutely delighted to be here. It's such an honour coming down to the beautiful Tasmania, and I look forward to engaging with you all tonight. Well, it's almost twee to say, and it goes without saying, that conflict is a terrible, terrible thing. It causes immense short and long-term suffering. It destroys people, communities, health systems, education, critical infrastructure, culture, and trust, but it also destroys the natural environment. The battlefield of today and the future is often a place of deliberate dehumanisation. And sadly, our earliest history as a species shows that our inhumanity to humanity has a deep part of who we are. Now, to try and get our head around armed conflict, statistics aren't very useful. They're hard to first get, and secondly, they don't tell the whole story. But sometimes I feel it's important to sit for a moment with the statistics and think broadly about them. So if you go way back to the statistics of over 70 million people killed or their lives lost in World War II, almost 1,900,000 of lives lost in the Vietnam conflict. And then today, if you come to the estimates of what's going on today, approximately 600,000 dead over the last 2 years in Ethiopia, 500,000 killed in Syria, and the UN estimate currently of at least 23,000 casualties in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, with 8,000 civilians killed. So numbers are big, and I know sometimes we have to take numbers and think of the biggest place we might know, a sporting field, and then multiply it. But they don't tell the true story, and I've had such an honour and a privilege over the last few years to see those statistics but understand the suffering behind it. My most recent mission I did before I came back to Australia was in Mozambique, where up north there was a range of non-state armed groups that were coming across villages and beheading men. And I had the privilege to spend some time down south in the internally displaced camps and to spend half a day sitting with a particular lady. She had seen her husband beheaded and then walked for hundreds of miles from the north down to the south with her 2 children, one small on her back and one 8 walking, but also with her sister who was blind, and therefore in that community her disability meant that her husband had left her. And it really struck me the intersectionality of the fact that if you don't have equality in peace, if you have groups, communities that aren't equally treated, armed conflict exacerbates the pre-existing inequalities. And when we were talking to her, because one of the key roles that we were doing there was taking Red Cross messages and trying to trace children, there was thousands of children that as people had fled down south, had been missing, probably taken by the groups, the rebel groups, to be turned into child soldiers. And we're trying to work out how to trace those children and bring them back to the communities. But I asked her, what is the biggest thing? What do you really need? Because she took me into a little house which was dirt floors. It was really very basic. And she talked to me about the fact that what she really wanted was a bed, some sort of wooden structure that her and her children and her sister could sleep on. And I pointed to the fact that whilst the environmental impact of having 300,000 people flee down from the south down to the north, the impact, when you looked around, the trees cut down, the environmental impact was massive, there was still enough wood. So I said, why don't you get it made? She said, well, in my culture, it's traditional that only men can make beds, and I haven't got a male in my family to do that. So they were sleeping on floor with mats. It's only a small story, and I've had so many others when I visited Mogadishu, Iraq and other countries. But it really struck me the need for us to be very nuanced about understanding the wider suffering that armed conflict causes. So I would say that my first point tonight, in many ways, if we think about the future battlefield, is that the suffering caused, short and long term, means that perhaps the place for humanity is to make sure that we work extremely hard not to have wars. And this is an unusual thing for an international humanitarian law expert to talk about. But I feel in reflecting on my 30 years in this area, there is something about the terrible human suffering and something about the fact that the pacifism movement, which is strong, intelligent, bold and inspiring, has been taken by authorities and squashed into a corner, and it isn't seen as a viable solution. And so my first point is really, if we want to look about the future battlefields, one of the things we should be leaning into is working better at how do we stop war itself? How can we have a more invigorated, intelligence, evidence-based discussion and discourse around the fact that we need to work even harder at peace building, and perhaps we'll come back to that during questions. Because I think one of the key things about armed conflict is it's very clear, and I've seen this over and over again visiting people who are detained, prisoners of war and others, that suffering is both a consequence, but it's also a cause of armed conflict and violence. Often the people that the Red Cross might track who have been detained, who are tortured and treated badly, when they're released, they go on to treat people accordingly. So there's a vicious cycle here we need to look at. So that's my first point in a way. If we want to look at the future battlefield, perhaps try and get rid of the battlefield. But until we reach this goal, which is a long way off, but we need to put our backs into it, further work needs to be undertaken to make sure that the measures are taken to reduce suffering during armed conflict, to find that very critical small space of minimum standards that must be respected, that are encoded in international humanitarian law, the 4 Geneva Conventions, their number of protocols, and over 90 treaties relating to the prohibition of particular weapons. So I'm sure many of you in here tonight know that some of the key elements about international humanitarian law is the requirement to protect civilians or those who are no longer taking part in hostilities, the requirement of humane treatment of prisoners of war, the prohibition of acts such as sexual violence, torture, the use of starvation as a method of warfare, and the destruction of infrastructure necessary for the survival of the civilian population. And from that, think about dams, think about electrical grids. So the conventions themselves have over 350 articles, but they boil down to a very simple point. What they are saying very loudly is that what unites us as people is deeper and more profound than what divides us. And that whilst we might be at war with each other and there's incredible hatred, there is a limit to how we should treat each other. And created over many centuries, Tim's mentioned that they have been around for a long time, and certainly the 1949 Geneva Conventions, where they were consolidated, has been some time. They are a safeguard to the worst imaginable during times of armed conflict. Now, I know you're probably sitting there thinking, look, this is great and it's wonderful that there's treaties, but it doesn't work. Just need to read the newspaper, see on the 24-hour news cycle, all we see is breaches of this. And I think that's important. It's an important and sobering point, and it's something that in the 30 years I've been working in this area, whether I was with Australian Red Cross or with the ICRC, you get confronted with. And I think one of the things that is really important is to think about what role does law play. Law does not revolutionise human behaviour. It provides us a framework to be able to understand and work towards an aspiration. And at times we're highly critical when international law doesn't work and start talking about, is the law itself worth it? But if you think about it domestically, if we have laws against drink driving, if we have laws against murder, regularly, unfortunately, the law is broken, but we don't question whether the law is worthwhile. We question how can we have a policy process, an education process to move this forward. And I do want to say that, of course, the laws of war are better known for their breaches than their adherence. And in fact, what the laws of war try to do is prevent things happening. So it's sort of counterfactual. You have to be able to say what didn't happen rather than the news talks about what did happen. It's like domestically, today we haven't breached a certain code because there's been no murders. And a number of years ago, certainly when there was a discourse coming up that the laws of war were eroding, I had the pleasure with my team to look at how we can capture examples of where the laws of war actually worked and demonstrate that a change in policy, a change in calibre of particular weapon systems, a decision not to target a place that was a marketplace rather than a military objective, when things actually made a difference. And one of the big areas, and it's always to me the most emotional, is the Red Cross and Red Crescent, the tracing service that the national societies reunite family members when they've been torn apart due to conflict. And every time a Red Cross message is passed on, and it's many thousands, every time a prisoner is visited by the International Committee of Red Cross, and it's approximately 1 million individuals visited every year, that is the law of war in action. So I think we have to be sober and clear-eyed about the times it doesn't work, but also not cynical to undermine it. And about 5 years ago, the International Committee of Red Cross did a survey of 17,000 people across the globe, people in Afghanistan, in Yemen, as well as in some first world countries, asking them whether they thought the laws of war was a valuable framework. And it was fascinating to see the answers, because on the whole, those who had experienced conflict were much more positive about the fact that it made it a little bit better for them than those who hadn't directly experienced conflict. And it sometimes made me think that cynicism is perhaps the luxury of never having to confront the challenges. But so I wanted to say that because often when we talk about the laws of war, it's the first thing that comes to people's mind. Don't always work, but when they do, they make a huge difference. So if we look at the future battlefield, which is what tonight is to be focused on, the first thing one has to do is analyse what sort of trends are we seeing today in the way war is fought. The first one, of course, has to be that there's an increase in strained relationships between powerful states, and you see this played out in the situation, for example, in Ukraine, and a lot more tension and rumbling, what we call peer-to-peer conflict, which is conflict between countries themselves. Now, this new element is overlaid onto a number of decades of mostly armed conflicts being non-international, internal in nature. And every year the International Committee of Red Cross does an analysis to work out how many conflicts are being fought globally at one time. And at the moment, I talked to my colleagues quite recently, there's an estimate of 100 armed conflicts being waged at the moment globally, with and that's tripled since 2000, with 60 states involved and over 100 non-state armed groups. So whilst I find in Australia reading the newspaper you only get fragmented pieces, there is a lot of armed conflict occurring. And so I think you would say one of the trends is an increase in armed conflict, an increase in the complexity of both international armed conflicts and domestic. But the second trend I think one has to look at in analysing what do we need to do to ensure there's humanity on the future battlefield is the temporal scope of conflicts. Today, conflicts are more protracted. They go for a longer period of time. If you look at places such as Syria, being involved in an internal armed conflict for over 12 years. And that has a certain challenge, both for the needs of the population. And certainly in my role in the last 8 years, it was very interesting to see this tension between immediate needs, food, water, sanitation, medical support. And if you've been in conflict for 12 years, issues arise such as education. Issues arise in a way that is not just the emergency response. So how do we think more carefully if conflicts in the future are intractable and they go for a protracted time, how do we make sure that the law is adjusted to this temporal scope? So we've got the type of conflicts, we've got the timing of conflicts, and then we've got what I would call the location of conflicts. It was known traditionally that militaries or armies fought for cities, and today we see an increase in the urbanisation of conflict. Militaries and non-state armed groups or military to military fighting in cities. And there's a massive impact of humanitarian consequences when you fight in densely populated areas. And there's been a lot of work done, and I was always so delighted and proud of my team working on this issue about certain weapon systems, explosive weapons, which were created for an open battlefield, but when they're used in places where there's high-rise apartments, has a massive human consequence. So how do we look at the methods and means of warfare if it's moved from wider places of fighting into urbanisation? The third area, which I think is very important in the future, is new technologies which are encroaching upon our lives daily. I wanted to book some tickets to go and see the wonderful museum you have here, and you had to do it online. From the smallest things that we have to do today to, of course, the mind frame of how we can use new technologies in warfare, and I'll spend a little moment on that. And finally, the growing concerns and the growing depth of understanding of the terrible impact of armed conflict on the natural environment. And I did want to spend a moment on the environment. So traditionally, the impact of conflict on the environment has not really been a big issue discussed in international humanitarian law. You had a number of principles found in the treaty. You've got Article 55 of Additional Protocol 1 that talks about the prohibition of damage to the natural environment, but it had words such as widespread and long-term and severe. And we know today that the very vulnerable ecosystems of the environment have a relationship with each other, that this high threshold is really in many ways outdated as we've got more information. And I certainly found in many of my trips, particularly in African countries, I really could see the compounding of suffering on the civilian populations that were already suffering with herders unable to move their cattle across places to find food, farmers themselves with droughts, with floods. We in Australia experienced this. So what we started to hear from our colleagues in the field, because there's 20,000 people who work for the ICRC in conflicts across the globe, and they would make their representation to say we've got to lean in more heavily in how we can do some regulations around the laws of war and the natural environment. And that's always been a very fascinating way of moving the law forward in ICRC's experience. It comes from hearing and listening to what people are experiencing on the ground, and that information gets filtered up to headquarters, and then we look at whether there should be a legal analysis, a policy analysis, who is it that we need to lobby to make sure that the reality of what people are experiencing during conflict catches up. So if you look at a few sobering, again, facts, over 80% of major conflicts today are held in biodiverse hotspots. Of the 25 countries identified as the most vulnerable to climate change, 14 of those are mired in conflict. And those 14 countries have very little resources because of the conflict to adjust. So I think if we do a bit of a mapping between where there's environmental vulnerabilities and where there's conflicts, you do see a relationship. And there's probably been more literature and more analysis of the way that fighting for natural resources creates conflict, and a little less on, well, when the conflict occurs, what impact does it have? So about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, I was delighted in Geneva to be able to launch for the ICRC the guidelines on the protection of the natural environment. And these guidelines set out 32 rules and recommendations for parties in conflict. And one of the key things, without going through the rules, and once again happy to talk more about it in the questions, but one of the key elements is that the natural environment should be classified as civilian in nature. That may not mean much to international lawyers, but traditionally there hasn't been much thought about how you classify the natural environment. And you've seen the natural environment being bombed completely to get rid of any coverage where people might hide, or the parties in a conflict might hide. You've seen the natural environment being setting oil wells on fire. You've also got the issue of the role itself. When big militaries arrive in a country, how do they destroy all their plastics? There's been some terrible toxics released because of the military themselves having to burn all the plastics in which they use to allow their own militaries to have the lifestyle that they required. So it's really critical to see the environment as civilian in nature and to be able to ensure that unless it's being directly used in hostilities, that it is protected. And I've had some really interesting interfaces and presentations from NATO in Brussels to in the Pentagon to many, many countries globally, discussing with those in positions of authorities the importance of having protection of the environment in doctrine, military doctrine, in training, and even in accountability issues. So that's one area that I think is really important to take higher up on the political scale, that the environment is obviously an existential issue to our survival, and we need to be more careful and mindful of the impact armed conflict has. The other element that the International Committee of Red Cross created with the colleagues in the Federation was guidelines for humanitarian organisations themselves when they go in to do humanitarian work. I think there was this sense of looking at your own footprint as well as talking to parties in a conflict. And when we sat and looked at it, it's really, really important that when you move in with the massive trucks to provide humanitarian assistance, when you provide bags of rice or food, when you set up tents, how do you do it in a way that's environmentally sustainable? And I have the pleasure of looking at some academic work in the area of natural disasters. And it was a classic example in Tonga not that long ago, where in responding to a natural disaster, a lot of water, bottled waters, was sent to Tonga and given to the civilian population because they needed fresh water, and they didn't have the capacity to recycle. So suddenly you've created a really big problem with a lot of plastic left over from a humanitarian activity. How can we think more carefully, more mindfully, and in a more humanitarian way of our own footprints as humanitarians? So I think going forward, the future battlefield has to take into account the natural environment. I mentioned before the issue of new technologies, and it's very interesting if you look back in military history that ever since the crossbow was created, there's been sort of writings and concerns about the dehumanisation of armed conflict when the fighting parties can't look each other in the eye, the movement away from seeing a human agent or a human to suddenly having systems in conflict and the conduct of hostilities that dehumanise the other even further. And I think we see this over and over again with the creation, very fast developments and use of cyber warfare, autonomous weapon systems, and artificial intelligence. And I recently wrote a short blog with a colleague of mine or a friend of mine, looking at this idea of what makes us human and what are we prepared to delegate of our intrinsic human role to machines. Can we delegate death of another human to an algorithm? And I think there's a whole lot of legal issues, but there's also a whole lot of ethical issues that I think at the moment the international community is not having the right debates. And I compared it to the use of new technologies. I think one of the big things about being human is creating other humans, having children. And if you look, I think 30 or longer years ago when they started using technologies in the creation of life, IVF, using new technologies, look at the raft of debates, the religious inputs, the discussions, I would say a mass of legal frameworks around the use of technology in the creating of life. And right now we have a lot of development, very fast, about the use of technology in the taking of life, but there doesn't seem to be a correlating religious, ethical, community underpinning on what do we expect as humans. Is this something that is acceptable in an ethical sense? But even moving on from the ethics, in the legal sense, there is a range of really complicated issues, from accountability to predictability of particular weapon systems. And since 2015, just after I started, the ICRC in my department, we were talking to and urging states to come up with a clarity around what is the level of human control required along the chain of command. At what point does the human control no longer have a role? And frankly, states came up with all sorts of ideas, but we felt after almost 8 years, it was really important to move forward, particularly as we know how quickly these systems, particularly autonomous weapon systems, are developing. So I was really honoured in 2001 with the president of the ICRC to launch and to call at a state party meeting or with the ambassadors in Geneva, a call that the ICRC has put out that we believe there's requirements for a new legally binding rules or some sort of format to deal with autonomous weapon systems, and particularly two types. The first type being unpredictable autonomous weapon systems. And it was always so much fun for me because not only in my department did I have over 150 lawyers, 100 military officers, many policy and diplomacy and engagement with academics, but we would bring in some of what I'd call the technical call the boffins, the people who were involved in the creation of weapons, to actually explain to us what is the aim of this weapon. And we were deeply concerned with weapons that were unpredictable. So they didn't say, hey, tonight we want you to target the bridge in Hobart. They would put in a broad instruction, but not have a time or a particular target in mind. And the unpredictability of these weapons, when you're dealing with all the other things I mentioned, urbanisation of conflict, natural environment, non-international armed conflicts, the whole range of issues we see going forward, was really concerning. So a call to ban the unpredictable autonomous weapons and also those that aim to kill humans, so anti-personnel autonomous weapon systems. And I think it really is about whether we want to substitute human decision over life and death matters to software. Now, I've had many interesting, fascinating discussions where people say, well, humans aren't doing a great job, so maybe the clarity, the precision of weapons, artificial intelligence is so smart, it learns, and there's no doubt that often there is, or sometimes there is, deaths based on misinformation. But often the reason that many people die in armed conflict is not because they've made a mistake, but because it's an intent. And you will be able to factor into the command of artificial intelligence the intent to do certain things. And also there is a whole lot of research being done about how in programming it's a likelihood to put in a range of biases. So I think it's really interesting area. The future battlefield is very interesting. One of the things that I felt, actually my young son at the time thought was okay with mum's job, is when I had to give a presentation and papers at the United Nations on outer space law, which people think just sounds sort of like something in a movie. But in fact, the ICRC has great concerns as there is developing more capabilities to do out of space attacks, either kinetic or non-kinetic, whether there's enough thought by authorities of the humanitarian consequences, whether this be debris that falls from such attacks or the disabling of dual use or critical infrastructure. So I think that we also need to look visionary ahead about where future battlefields are going in their locations. I didn't want to leave the topic of new technologies without obviously identifying that there's massive benefits for humanity in new technologies. We know that. And I saw it firsthand when I saw in some of the really difficult places that we needed to go as an institution, that they was able to do some elements with telemedicine, the identification of people who might be lost. So there's some great benefits. And one of them, which I think has been very interesting to watch and oversee over the last 8 years, is the development of a digital emblem. You may be very aware that the red cross on a white background is a legally recognised sign that says don't shoot. And certainly any time I went into conflict zones or dangerous places, you wear a big red cross. You never carry guns. Your four-wheel drives have a red cross on it. And hospitals, for example, have a big red cross either on their roof or a flag. And what we realised in our research that is it's definitely hospitals with all the critical infrastructure of the machines to keep people alive, the records, a whole range of ways that hospitals in times of armed conflict are very vulnerable to cyber attacks. And so working with a number of universities, the Red Cross has come up with a digital emblem, which is a digital marking which sits into the system that correlates with the physical one. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom about new technologies, but we've got to make sure that we carefully analyse where are we going, not to get overwhelmed and excited by what can be done, but what do we want to be done with new technologies. There's many other areas that I could mention tonight, but I see I'm probably running out of time, about the way war is waged and how we need to respond to it. Things such as the acknowledgement of the mental health impacts upon the civilian population and the military themselves, parties to the conflict, and whether that issue about mental health should be factored into concepts around proportionality. Diversity and inclusion factors. Gender and international humanitarian law has been a passion of mine for 20 years at least. And how to drive home the fact that women and men, boys and girls, experience armed conflict in a different way. Goes back to my start. If you don't have equality, armed conflict exacerbates the inequality. And I've certainly done a lot of work in this area, and I'm happy to talk about it in the questions. Some of the key principles in IHL, the need to take all due care in undertaking military operations. How can you undertake all due care if you don't understand the different roles in society that gender is playing? And disability. We know that at least 14% of the world's population has live with some disability. And I saw that really practically when we were working to make sure that we could evacuate civilians in Ukraine, the creation of humanitarian corridors. And it was great. We were doing some work in the legal and policy area on updating some of the laws or the commentaries, the understanding of the laws. And we were able to talk with our operation colleagues and say, when you're having those buses, have you got wheelchair ramps? Are you able to ensure that people know that they're in a building but that they can come and be evacuated? So how to take things such as the creation of human corridors and take into account the fact that we need to have it accessible for all. So my first point was we need to get rid of war and we need to work hard at that. And my second point, hopefully you've picked up, is we need to urge, we need to push, we need to shout to elevate international humanitarian law to a higher political priority. We need to not just focus on the prosecution of war criminals. Tim and I have worked in this area, and you know Tim is globally recognised as an outstanding expert in that area. That is a very important part of the puzzle. But we also need to work on prevention. We also need to make sure that if weapons are being supplied, if governments are giving support, that there's a connection with an obligation to follow these minimal standards in armed conflict. We also need to make sure that in guidelines, in political commitments, in discourse, in the general public, it's understood that even wars have limits and that we want to stand up for that. So in conclusion, we do know that international humanitarian law isn't always followed. But we do also know that when it is followed, it makes a huge difference and brings a space for humanity on the battlefield. We also know that the following of international humanitarian law, the reduction of sexual violence, the non-use of child soldiers, not using weapons that are prohibited, is a fragile step towards peace, because the more suffering, the more likely it'll be intractable. So let's elevate an appetite for the reduction of suffering during armed conflict. Let's lean into the concept that the future battlefields in all its form still have a strong place for humanity, update it with the understandings, whether it be about the environment, new technologies, the location, the protraction of conflict. And whilst we're doing all of this, let's ultimately work towards the aim of eradicating the destruction, the horror and the unacceptability of waging war. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. Wonderful lecture. And there'll be a formal vote of thanks in due course. But now it's time for us to open the floor physically as well as the virtual one for any questions that you might have for Helen.
My name's Peter Davson-Galley. I'm a philosopher. I am curious about your response to the, hey, it would be lovely, international humanitarian law. It'd be good if it could have an effect, but it's impotent. And you say, well, when it does have an effect, it's great. So given that it's a standard challenge against these frameworks that no one takes any notice of them and other things are more powerful and away go the wars anyway, what advice would you have or experience that you can retail to us about how to get it becoming less of a futile activity? What are the levers to be pulling here, and by whom?
Thank you. And I hope it didn't come across that I was it's not that good, occasionally works. I think what I was wanting to be is really honest and transparent with the fact that most of us only see it when it doesn't work. And at times I do get a little cynical myself when there's a discourse that because there's a law, the world's going to be okay. And to me, one of the answers is tenacity, long periods of time, making sure that you don't get too down. When you see it breached, you have to learn from that and pivot going forward. But I think your point is a really important one. And one of the pieces of research that we did in the ICRC related to what is it that actually has an impact on the behaviour of soldiers. Is it the fear of prosecution? Is it bad commanders? Is it hatred? And so a massive study was done called Roots of Restraint in Armed Conflict, where we basically had people go into the field, and whether it be the military or the non-state armed groups, interviewing thousands and thousands. And what was really interesting was that it came down to, as most things in life, are diverse factors. I mean, certainly fear of prosecution is one element, but the strongest thing we came across was cultures in the military, where there's a sense that on one hand, there are laws, but on the other hand, you sort of ignore them. And I think, if I can be honest, we saw that played out today, where you see pockets of a military such as the Australian military that has excellent reputation, a lot of training. Tim and I have done years of training of the military in international humanitarian law, but often a cultural element can seep in. And so we came up with all sorts of ideas. I remember once giving a presentation in a particular Asian country where we gave a talk on the laws of war to the military, and then their song as they marched back to the barracks, their marching song, the informal infrastructure power dynamics, was absolute contrary to what they'd just learned in the formal. And certainly I didn't propose that my legal and policy and military colleagues should start writing marching songs. But it was really about trying to understand, where does the power sit? Where does the influencing factor sit, and how you can work on that as much as working on the formal structure. So one of the things that we often think is that life is through the I would say the vertical. You create a law, you train people about it, you make sure you prosecute them if it doesn't happen, and you're going to change behaviour. But we also learnt that I would say the horizontal, the cultural, the hazing ceremonies are important as well. So that resulted in, actually I put on a number of psychologists and a sociologist into the mix with lawyers and others to look at that. And just on that topic, it was fascinating to see in the non-state armed groups where the power sat. And in a lot of the tribal work that my colleagues did, and also in some of my missions, it would be the witch doctors that would bless the warriors before they went off, that would have as much power to talk about, and you do understand as a warrior, you don't do this, as the formal commanders. So I think one of the answers going forward is to continue to work on the normative structure, continue to have prosecutions, new norms if we need them, but also to have a deeper understanding of human psychology to really drive home a culture that breaching the laws of war is unacceptable.
Thanks for the question, Peter, and thanks for the great answer, Helen.
Hi, Marie Taylor. I'm actually a health worker, so I love the empathetic approach here. Following on from your comments, though, one of obviously all of our concerns, I'm sure, is the fact that when you're talking about developing a culture and where's the power in developing that culture, in many cases, of course, it comes from above, from the leadership. And historically and currently, we're seeing real examples of leadership that is based on narcissistic and psychopathic personalities. And by definition, those personalities don't care. They don't have empathy. So I wonder how you engage with personalities in that role.
Yeah, thank you. They're both fabulous questions. We could have a whole seminar on just those two questions. I think that's a really profound question. I think the first thing is to perhaps what I've had to do in my life is engaging with many individuals in the field, military commanders, political leaders that are not doing good things, and to come at it not necessarily immediately with a judgmental mind frame, but to try and understand the pressures and the elements that that individual is under. And then, of course, you reach a thresh point where that is no longer appropriate. But I've certainly found that in a lot of the successes the International Committee of the Red Cross has had to get access to visit prisoners of war and others to authorities that you might think would never allow us to do that has been because there's been a real attempt to have a human conversation at the heart of it rather than coming in a judgmental sense. But I do think that's when some of the other tools we have, and I mentioned international criminal law, I mean, the indictment of senior leaders, whether it be Putin or others, may not immediately allow for them to be prosecuted, but makes life difficult. It puts pressure. We've also got to find ways that powerful states can pressure each other and also other states to try and find bridges to build between. So it's the million-dollar question because when people are in positions of authority, it's very, very difficult to unwind that. But I think we have to use all the tools in our toolkit from understanding where they're coming from and trying to see what is needed to move the situation forward, using powerful tools such as international criminal law and also using state diplomacy. But I don't know, Tim, I mean, I'm sure you've got a lot to say on that too.
Yeah, I'm loving listening to the answers. There's a follow-up question online, Helen, from Peter. What options are there for addressing some of the key root causes for war? Corruption, intolerance, state governance, ideological extremism. You've probably got several others that you'd add to the list, but would you like to have a go at answering that for Peter?
Certainly. Thank you, Peter. Always nice to see people online. And I think I've spent most of my career, 30 years, looking at reducing of suffering during conflict. And it really is having stepped out of my former role that I'm reflecting much more heavily about peace and the pacifist movement. And one of the things I think is magnificent about the Red Cross movement is we have the national societies as well as the International Red Cross, but all the national societies like the fabulous Australian Red Cross and many others I've visited across the globe really do peace work, I would say. They work at reducing inequalities in society. They work with getting vulnerable people that if you don't address their needs, have nothing left to lose. And that is where you start seeing elements of conflict rising up. So I think it's multidimensional. I'm not an expert in this area, but I would be, I wish we had time to have a chat about it. But I think there's something there. We track, for example, the treatment of women. When you see the treatment of women going down, you can track the closer it gets in relation to potential tensions and armed conflict. Infant mortality rates, the infrastructure that people need has often been correlated with, if you can't get that right, you're moving closer to a situation of the use of violence to resolve these problems. So I would say, coming back to a depth of understanding the equality in society is probably an excellent starting point to try and reduce armed conflict.
I've got another online question from an anonymous attendee. What impact do you think the changes in the behaviour and approaches of humanitarian actors is having on adherence to IHL? Do you see the blurring of the definition of humanitarian action, for example, into development or taking on more political approaches, a cause for concern? It's a double whammy, but the second part of the question follows the first. So.
It's a big one. Thank you, Anonymous, for asking that question, because it's something that's many things have, I would say, keep me awake at night, but actually I'm a pretty good sleeper. But certainly when I'm in my waking hours, have made me reflect on. And I think I mentioned that in the speech. The protracted nature of conflict has resulted in quite deep and philosophical debates in a place like the International Committee of Red Cross of how fit is the humanitarian system. So traditionally, the humanitarians go in, the ICRC will go in, it provides immediate support, and then it might withdraw and allow the national society to follow on. For example, in a place like Syria, traditionally, when the conflict would start, we would make sure that there was enough water. So water facilities, bottled water, or the capacity to have clean water would be sent in. Now, when you've got a conflict that spans over a decade, we started looking at having to send in engineers to re-establish the water systems and the water infrastructure. Now, on the continuum, that's more like development work than it is emergency work. But if you see the needs of the population, and to be honest, with donors, the cost efficiency of trucking water into a country rather than re-establishing the pipelines, you do start seeing this almost philosophical blurring between long-term development work and the immediate humanitarian work. And there was a lot of skepticism within the International Committee of Red Cross of taking up an issue such as the environment. There was a sense that the environment is not the space where humanitarians should be in because it's sort of long-term. But I think as long as you have a rigorous analysis, when we did policy making, we'd always do the 3 E's. What is the evidence? What are we hearing? What is the experience of people suffering? And what is the expertise that we can bring to that? And so I think it doesn't concern me if it's done in a careful, responding to the needs of the population with a clear mind frame that the reason why we're now sending engineers to set up the water structure rather than trucking in water is not because we want to become a development actor, but because the needs are such in this protracted conflict. But I think in this area, once again, great questions down here in Tassie. It's a whole seminar in and of it, because if it starts blurring too much, just without being too boring about it, you've got international humanitarian law, the law of war, which is a very tough area of law. I mean, if you think about it, it says you can kill that person, but you can't kill that person. And it's applied in a very particular time. You can lock people up for an indefinite amount of time, even if they haven't committed a crime, and that's what you do for prisoners of war. But there's regulations about how you do it and when you let them go. And that's during times of armed conflict, lex specialis, as they say. But at the same time, you've got human rights law, and elements still continue in conflict, but that usually looks more at the development issues. How do you live life to the best of your capacity? So you've got these 2 different areas of international law, and the growing realisation that conflict is changing, and we have to be very, very careful that they don't get so blurred they become the same things. But at the same time, we have to, I think, deeply have to address the humanitarian needs and the humanitarian consequences that you witness when you are anywhere engaged in conduct of hostilities. So it's not a very precise answer. I think it's an important point you're raising, but I think as long as we locate all our thinking first with what is the human impact and work out from there, I think we're going in a right direction.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Over to you.
This one follows a little bit on from a previous question. Just looking at the leadership, when we look at the declining leadership of some of the world's institutions, and probably also the decline of the quality and the credibility of our world leaders, the issues you've raised today really need strong leadership. Where do you think the leadership to lead us forward out of future mayhem is going to come from?
That's another $1 million question. This is a very expensive event. Thank you. I think that's really important. I want to take a step back from your question first. And a lot of time as a director at the ICRC, we looked at the issue of trust. And I think you might have heard at the start when I talked about one of the things that armed conflict does is it actually destroys trust. And a lot of the research today indicate that when you ask people who do they trust, they don't trust authorities, they trust people like me. It's called people like me. They trust people who are like them rather than the hierarchy of authorities. And I think there's something where we need courageous and compassionate leadership. I deeply believe leadership has to be a balance between courage and compassion, where I think we need to reactivate people's appetite and people's desire and people's expectation for that sort of leadership. Because a bit like talking about the laws of war, when people say, oh, but it doesn't work, so it's not useful, and what are we doing? We've got to be able to say that you can see when there's good leadership and we can see the impact that has. So we should have an expectation and appetite. So I think leadership needs to come from obviously clearly above, as the intrinsic nature of leadership is, but also we need to have people, and I talk to my kids, and my kids are at uni with their friends, young people, everyone, understanding that we should have an expectation of leaders, and not to say, well, all politicians are corrupt, why would we bother? But to really tell better narratives about the value of leadership. So once again, it's a big question, and I'm not sure I've got much of an answer, but I've reflected a lot, and it comes down to trust, it comes down to what we expect, and it comes down to, I would say, profiling the difference in a country between good leaders and bad leaders.
Got another question from online, and then we'll come to you over in the front row. From Isabel, Helen, is it harder to produce laws and legislation in the international law space because of the advancement in technology becoming more and more exponential, where we can't keep laws up to date fast enough?
Thank you, Isabel. And maybe you read one of the blogs that I've recently had the luxury of time to write. The fascinating thing about the Geneva Conventions, and more particularly Additional Protocol 1, which is the place that really regulates conduct of hostilities, talks about weapons. Well, it doesn't talk about weapons. It talks about principles to look at new weapons, because some of the really early Hague regulations, and Tim and I know this well, talk about the prohibition of dropping certain caliber weapons out of balloons, because at the time, that's how armed conflict was fought. And if we had to update the laws every time a new weapon system came along, the key laws, the laws about distinction, proportionality, military necessity, precautions in attack, really the key backbone of international humanitarian law, you'd be negotiating all the time. So one of the challenges we have today is exactly that we have principles, but it's really hard to also even get a grasp. That's why for the first time we had to bring into the International Committee of the Red Cross people who were experts on weapon systems, because we didn't even know what we were dealing with. We had the backbone, don't create weapons that cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Don't create weapons that cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants. And one of the challenges we had is that most of the weapons that have been developed into treaties, or treaties have been developed about them in the last few decades, we've known the impact. With anti-personnel landmines, we heard from our colleagues in the field, the doctors, the medical people in conflicts, to say there is an unacceptable amount of suffering of kids, of grandmas, of farmers having their legs blown up, having their lives destroyed, being killed because of the use of anti-personnel landmines that kept killing after the conflict. So we were able to take the experience from the ground, put it up through to a legal policy level and say, what does the law say? Well, the law says you can't use weapons that don't distinguish. This is pretty clear. This weapon doesn't distinguish. The law says this, the law says that. And it's the same with many, the transfer of small arms. We knew the humanitarian consequences of that. The use of cluster munitions, the use of blinding laser weapons. But what I experienced in the last decade in trying to work with an institution that was forward-leaning is that we had to imagine what the consequences of these new weapons were. I remember asking my colleagues in the field, sending out a message saying, could anyone please write back about the experiences you've seen in a conflict environment where there's been a cyber attack? And we did get some information about, well, we saw that the electricity went down, or we saw there wasn't access to, but we had to actually almost war game what would happen if you had a major cyber attack where all systems went down. What would happen if there was a vast use of autonomous weapon systems and conflict became even more asymmetrical, which means, you had some wealthy countries who could wage war without ever killing a soldier against the bodies of those who might not have the money to have those weapon systems. So yes, at the moment we're in a really complex place of trying to keep ahead and thinking through the consequences of the use of particular weapons. And in this particular blog I wrote recently, one of the things we proposed was there's this fabulous clause called the Martin's Clause, which talks about if you've got a new developing area and the law, you're not sure where the law is on it, you use the dictates of public conscience. Now, to have the dictates of public conscience, the public has to be aware The public has to be able to feel either outraged or comfortable, tolerant with the use of killing through algorithms, or saying, no, this is not what being a human is about. And so that's why I think it's really important we have these debates beyond just the military academy and academia and the weapons developers, so that the public themselves can start thinking about what is acceptable and what is not. But this is hard work. I think we need to work towards it, but it's certainly complex at the moment trying to, I mean, certainly I've heard from a number of states, how can you ban a weapon when we don't really know what it's going to do? It might be a great weapon system. So I think we're at a very interesting time, and we need to use all our rigour to move forward and ensure that we continue to have humanity with new technologies on the battlefield.
In the front row down here.
Thank you. Are our current ways of living in a consumeristic and capitalistic society responsible for, essentially armed conflict and the environmental issues? And is it time to realize that, the current systems that we have in place are no longer applicable as they might have been a few hundred years ago, and constantly focusing on economics and dollar value for everything?
Well, thank you. That's a good philosophical question too. I mean, there's something about the systems and the values that we're currently involved in that do make... Let me step back a bit for a moment. I've always been interested in some of the research that talks about the fact that in animals there is more humanity than we often think about, because you hear, well, it's a dog-eat-dog world. We need to all strive, it's the fittest survive, some of these theories that are inherent philosophically in capitalism. And there's a lot of research, and some great scholars have written on the fact that actually you do see here animals being a lot more humane to each other than you think. I know this sounds a long journey to answer your question, but I've often been reflecting on how do you get the best of human nature to shine out. And I do think there's something in the systems, in the way we value people through how much money they earn versus value other processes. And I think there's a deep and profound debate to be had there in the space of listening more to our Indigenous population, and also listening more and understanding about the environment. There's debates happening there that I think need to move more closely into the systems and structures of how we set ourselves up. But I'm answering less as a humanitarian lawyer and more as Helen Durham, who's no longer with the Red Cross, so I've got some freedom. So thank you for that question. And I think there's a lot to think about in that space.
Just going to go to question up the back from Matthias.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for an excellent presentation. You mentioned during the presentation the temporal limitations of war, and also in one of the answers to one of the questions you spoke about this distinction between an international humanitarian law paradigm and what we might call a law enforcement or a human rights paradigm. And I understand that in both policy, legal and academic circles in IHL there's debate about how do we determine the end of an armed conflict, and when can we say that we're definitively moving into that law enforcement paradigm. And obviously there are key protection concerns when we think about IHL applying, so that the civilian population is protected. But there's also the permissive aspects of IHL, which you mentioned, which allow the killing of soldiers and allow attacks that envision a certain degree of human suffering and harm. So I was wondering what your perspective on some of those debates are, and I think the valid criticism that there's a risk, at least, that the promotion of IHL in certain contexts needs to be aware of these permissive aspects, and when to sort of advise parties to the conflict or policymakers to stop using lethal force.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really good one. And I mean, I reflected a lot on this question because, of course, you can look at international humanitarian law as a permissive framework. It allows, as I mentioned very bluntly, it's not technically, but it allows a certain use of force only at certain people and only at certain objects. Or, as often I find with the military, they find, or not always the military, but I've also had discussions where they see, no, IHL is very restrictive. So between being a permissive normative framework or a restrictive normative framework, there's a lot of different debates about, well, no, actually it stops us doing stuff. It doesn't allow us to do things. It tells us what weapons we can use, what military tactics, how the conduct of hostilities can be undertaken. And I do think the And it was more of a policy articulation followed up with use of force. But I do think when a global war on terror was announced, global war on terrorism, which is like saying there's a war on drugs. I mean, it's not international humanitarian law. It was an approach that involved a range of use of force, sanctions, and a range of things. We started, I think, that was the point where we started having a bit of confusion, because if you've got a global war on terrorism, and one of the obligations in international humanitarian law is that when the war's finished, you repatriate those you've detained. Now, how do you know when a war on an ideology finishes? So how can you then apply a framework that was created for a very specific situation? So I suppose in answer to your question briefly, because this is one that we can spend a lot of time talking about, I do believe that we need to be intellectually rigorous in understanding why we want to use a particular principle at a particular time. And it does drive me crazy. Sometimes people talk about, the IHL issues, and you're like, no, that's a pre-conflict or post-conflict situation. So I personally have a desire that we have a framework to some degree. But it's not an easy debate. And I've always seen international humanitarian law as a place to reduce suffering, and therefore it needs to take into the temporal scope of conflict, but also not completely move into a law enforcement paradigm. But if I may use one example, a really practical one, over the years, the International Committee of Red Cross has had armed forces delegates, and I had the honour of having them in my department. But we found from our colleagues in the field increasingly asking for for police as well. As you sort of got a lower threshold of conflict, we realised that the police were often used in situations that were sort of conflict-like. And so we started training police, particularly in many of the places in Latin America, as well as the military. And I always saw that as very symbolic. I'd look at that part of my department. I'd say, oh, we've got an increase in police. So the two legal paradigms are starting to have a much stronger interface than was traditionally thought.
Okay, so this is from an anonymous attendee, Helen, again. I assume it's a different person, but who would know? The question is about the urbanisation of conflict. How should IHL adapt to the new battlefields and the challenges of the co-location of military targets and civilians? For example, how do we deal with claims of human shielding in urban areas, which is sometimes used to justify attacks and shift the blame to the other side?
Now, the good one, I haven't had one bad question tonight. This is wonderful. It's a big one. The urbanisation of conflict has been a massive theme that in the last 3 or 4 years we've really put a lot of energy into. And I think I might have mentioned the fact that often militaries are trained to fight in a different situation. So I'm answering this in a practical way. One of the things we did with the armed forces delegates was to create a commander's handbook to train military, and also we engage with non-state armed groups on this matter too, to look at different ways of undertaking conduct of hostilities in heavily urbanised areas. And it was fascinating from a military point of view how some of the training had to be different in relation to the identification of targets and the proportionality. So proportionality is this strange concept that you can attack a military objective as long as the military aim is higher, is not disproportionate to the suffering of the civilians that you're going to undertake. And I think there's something about urbanisation, conflict in places that are highly urbanised, that puts a lot of pressure on the proportionality principle. And we had hours and hours of debate with very seasoned military commanders about how we can ensure that the interpretation of proportionality is relevant when you're in an urban environment. And certainly things such as intentional or unintentionally using human shields, because traditionally there was an understanding of the intentional use of human shields, which is a war crime, making sure that you surround a military objective with kindergarten kids so that the proportional balance gets out of whack and you can't attack it. But in an urban environment, you also have almost unintentional human shielding. And so there's a lot of issues to unpick in that respect. But I think sitting down with those who have to make the military strategy and understanding the pressures they're under. I did a lot of work with the WATHAB, the water sanitation colleagues, because what we found was if a bomb was dropped in an urban environment, often the complex water system in an urban place, if one place is destroyed, it meant that thousands and thousands of people weren't going to get water, which would result in dysentery and many, many more indirect deaths, which are not accounted in the same way that direct deaths are taken. So I really, I watch carefully and try and keep up with my readings as my colleagues continue to work on the urbanisation. But I do think some of these principles are not irrelevant, they just need to be stress tested.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks so much for being able to draw on that vast experience to answer the questions so insightfully. They're wonderful, thanks. It's my pleasure now to invite Julie Groom, who is the Executive Director of Australian Red Cross Tasmania, to come up to the podium and propose a vote of thanks to Helen. And you and I'll stay here while she does that.
This heartfelt vote of thanks on behalf of you all, but also on behalf of the Red Cross Oration Organising Committee. Today we've had the pleasure, the privilege of being inspired and enlightened by the remarkable presence of Dr Helen Durham, a true leader and humanitarian. And I think, Tim, you really summed that up in your heartfelt introduction. We've heard Helen reflect on the emerging challenges of modern warfare and the role of international humanitarian law in reducing the suffering during armed conflict. And it will leave many of us with thoughts and questions that will last way beyond this evening's event. We've heard about the dehumanising impact of war, and Helen illustrated this through stories and statistics. Helen talked about the exacerbation of pre-existing inequalities during conflict. Helen talked about the need for us to not have war, and that's something that personally resonates with me, although the world that we live in now, that's not what we see. And so it's really important that we focus on minimising the humanitarian impacts of war, including on our environment. I'd also like to thank Professor Tim McCormack and Professor Gino Del Pont for their contribution, for your welcome, your heartfelt welcome on this not cold winter evening in Tasmania. And as I said before, your heartfelt introduction and for emceeing tonight's event. Thank you both. I'd like to thank the audience, both in the room and online, for your active participation and your engaging questions, which, Helen has acknowledged. It's people's engagement and eagerness to learn that will help us to, embrace the laws of war and hopefully achieve a world without war. And finally, I'd like to thank the University of Tasmania for organising and hosting the 2023 oration and for the continuing partnership between Red Cross and UTAS that began, as we heard earlier, in 2007 with the very first oration in this building, the Sir Stanley Burberry Theatre. Thank you, Helen, thank you, Tim, and thank you to all of the people involved, including those in the back corner, who most of you may not have noticed on your way in, who have been involved in making this event such a success. I would just like to thank you and I guess have a call to action as we leave. And I know that Tim has some words before we do so. May we continue to work together towards a more compassionate, equitable and humanitarian world. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I'd like to also extend my thanks to the Red Cross Oration Organising Committee, of which you're a member, representatives from Australian Red Cross Tasmania and also from the university, and of course for Helen. This evening's talk will be soon available as a video and also as a podcast, and the links to either or both you'll be able to find on the Island of Ideas webpage. Just a plug for the next event, next Thursday, we'll be joining Agricultured Festival in Launceston, for the next event. Join our panel of experts at Inveresk or online to hear about Feeding Tasmania, our food future. You can register for that event and find out about others coming up on the website. Thanks again for coming out. It's been great to be with you, and I thought the questions were absolutely terrific, both in those of you physically present and those of you online. Thank you very much.